In today's episode, we're off to the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, to the small but strategically important island of Okinawa. The US invasion of the island in 1945 would be the largest amphibious landings in the Pacific theater and set the stage for the final phase of the war against Japan.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Another week, another podcast. Here we are again. So this time, we're not going to the deep, dark woods in Europe, but we're going to the deep, dark, you might say subtropical rainforest, perhaps, of Asia. And of course, as I just said in the introduction, we're looking at this very specific battle, this landing and the fighting at Okinawa in 1945. So I think the usual question that I always ask is, where do we start? And I think we all know the answer to this already, because we're going to start big before we then zoom in and have a look at what actually happened on the ground. So where do we want to start with this one? Do we take it all the way to the Middle Ages, as we sometimes do, to antiquity? Because sometimes we end up talking about I don't know what. I probably struggle to squeeze in Frederick the Great into this episode, but we'll see how it goes. Yeah.
You never know. There's some Clausewitz in there, perhaps, with decisive battles being sought by the Japanese. However, I don't think we'll go as far back as we did in our Japan-China war episodes, where we ended up way back into the 19th century.
Yeah.
This one will focus a little more. Before I dive into that, I just wanted to say to all you people out there listening and watching that one of the reasons why we chose this topic for today's episode, and maybe even a couple of future episodes, depending on how deep into the woods of Okinawa we end up going, is from our supporter feedback. Supporters of the podcast told us, hey, we'd like to have more on the Pacific theater. Since Matthias and I are more familiar with the European theater, we've done quite a bit on that. We have done some Asia-Pacific stuff, and we're going to do more in the future thanks to the feedback of our supporters. If you want to support us, just head over to our website at bothsidesofthewire.com. That being said, let us dive into 1945. Okinawa is, as you mentioned, Matthias, off the top, it's small, but it's strategically important. It's kind of in a sort of nexus about 550 kilometers south of Japan, something like 750-ish kilometers away from the Chinese coast. This idea to attack Okinawa, of course, it's not in isolation. It doesn't come out of nowhere. The United States, since, let's say, late 1943, has been pursuing, among other strategic objectives, this idea of island hopping, that you're going to choose some very important Japanese-occupied islands in the Pacific, not all of them, because there are too many for that. The war would take forever. But if you're the US, you choose the most important ones that allow you to then skip onwards hundreds of kilometers through the Pacific with these key islands where you can then base aircraft, supplies, you can have ships going in and out of there. A chain of islands towards Japan. They start this probably, I guess, with Tarawa, you could say, and then they continue it with some other famous landings. I mean, we won't list them all here, but there are places like Peleliu, there are places like Saipan and Tinian, for example, and others. And they're hopping ahead throughout 1944. And by the spring of 1945, the next one on the list is Okinawa. It's interesting, in addition to its strategic location, because it's kind of, at least, let's say, legally from the Japanese state point of view, it's Japan. It's part of the Japanese homeland. That's not quite culturally the case, but we'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about the civilians there. So the assault against Okinawa is kind of, let's say, the final phase of approaching the Japanese home islands, and the Americans hope that it can play a role in ending the war, because if you have this important island not that far from the Japanese home islands, you can better coordinate and base and supply and plan a possible invasion of Japan itself. So that is a very quick version of how the US ends up targeting Okinawa. But as usual, Matthias, in his German officer thoroughness, will probably fill in a couple of gaps or add a couple of nuggets that I left out.
Well, maybe I'd just start by talking a little bit about the structure of that particular island and the population. You mentioned it, and we'll get into much more detail later on when we talk about the actual fighting, because the civilian population actively and passively plays a very, very important role. But just to set that scene again a little bit, you already mentioned it. It is seen as mainland Japan at that particular stage. So it is the smallest of the 5, I think, mainland islands that form Japan. And the whole area around Okinawa is quite an interesting one, because it was a you might say, independent kingdom for hundreds of years. Don't worry, dear listeners and viewers, I'm not going to bore you with all the detail here now. But interesting, if you're interested in this, the relationship of this kingdom, this area that you have there with Japan, and also in particular with China, all the way to the 19th century. And in the 19th century, the Japanese basically take over, occupy this, and turn this into a part of mainland Japan. So that probably suffices, because otherwise I get carried away when we talk about this again. But it is, again, interesting when you look at this, because the relationship between what some people probably in those days would have still seen as the Japanese, perhaps oppressors, you might say, and the civilian population, because it's only really in the 1930s, and then particularly in the 1940s, that this Okinawa prefecture, as they call it, was really integrated into the Japanese structure. And also, of course, that means into the wartime regime, into the wartime economy, and what have you. That also meant that they're now enforcing standard Japanese language that has to be used. So they had their own language down there that's not allowed to be used anymore. You can't use that. Pronunciations of places change, and all these things. So it's a broader, you might call it, imperial assimilation policy by the Japanese. So slightly different from what we probably would understand under Okinawa today. We say, yeah, it is just basically, in inverted commas, just part of mainland Japan. In those days it is, but there are some undertones, undercurrents. It's all a bit more complex and a bit more detailed. And that also has an impact on how the Japanese are then going to fight. So I think that's quite important. You talked about the location where it sits, so southwest of the main islands. You talked about the island hopping, of course, that all makes perfect sense. And yes, boom, here you are. You've now entered mainland Japan. And you're now getting to a different type of fighting. It changes the war a little bit, doesn't it? The thinking about it, both for the Japanese, but also for the Americans. So you're now fighting a different type of war, because you are fighting for the mainland. So that always makes it a bit different. Talked about the dimensions. It's a funny little island, really, when you think about it. The shape is quite weird in some ways.
It's kind of snaky.
It's a bit snaky, isn't it? I thought like a half-crushed banana or something, but snake is probably much better. Yeah, so that's
you
what
heard
I
it here
thought.
first. Okinawa looks like a half-crushed banana. No offense to any Okinawan visitors. Just
but
bananas are delicious and healthy.
Absolutely, very, very good. Potassium and all that. Yeah. So it's about 100 kilometers. Jesse can't stop laughing. It's about 100 kilometers, I think 106 to be precise, from north to south, and around 10, 11 kilometers east to west. So really, really quite a long, thin, crushed banana. There we go.
I thought you would go for sausage, being a German. Come on, man.
Yeah, no, the shape's wrong. You see, it's not beautiful enough. Sausages are beautiful. So crushed bananas are slightly
less. Let's back to the history. Back to the history, please, before we get taken off the air.
Oh my God, here we go. And when you get the vegetation, it's also interesting. I mentioned, of course, the deep dug woods earlier. So you've got woods there as well. That is subtropical rainforest. And even today, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you've got one of the largest tracts of subtropical rainforests on Okinawa. I think these days it's mainly the northern part. Quite rocky as well. It's quite of limestone. You've got a karst area, which plays a role later on in the fighting as well. Mainly because when you fire artillery shells onto this, you get lots of splinters, and that plays a role in one very famous episode where an American general, jumping in ahead a little bit,
spoiler
gets
alert,
wounded and then killed. So that's also there, and that makes the whole thing, in some ways, you might also say quite complex for the Americans to attack, because you've got this vegetation, which is not easy. You've got the terrain, the shape of the island. It also presents challenges for the Japanese. How are you going to defend this? And of course, both sides are now sitting down, scratching their heads, and coming up with some sort of war plans and operational plans. And unless I've forgotten something now, maybe we can start looking at the general ideas of the attack and the defense. What do you think, Jesse?
I think that sounds like a capital idea, as they say. I just wanted to add about the geography, because of course, terrain is always key if you want to use kinetic means to achieve any sort of operational objective. That's going to be pretty important. Just so we have maybe a vision in our head, we have this, as we said, thin, long north-south with a bunch of little peninsulas and curves in it island. And it's the northern part that's forested, and it's also very hilly. So there are not only forests, but very steep hills up there. The southern part is, for example, a little bit flatter, but it has a series of caves in this limestone rock. And as we may know, dear listeners out there, the Japanese can put caves to good use in defense. So this is another challenge. There are also some limestone ridges in the south, which we're going to talk a fair bit about because they become some of the most famous features in the battle. And at the very southern tip of the island, you have the capital city or town called Naha. Again, apologies for pronunciation. And in terms of the civilian population, just to give an idea, I don't remember if you mentioned a number, Matthias, but there's something like 440,000 civilians on the island, just to give us a kind of an idea of the scale, right? So it's not that, it is small, but 440,000 civilians on a 10-kilometer wide island, most of them in the south, that's quite substantial, especially when those civilians are part of, as we said, from the American point of view, the enemy home turf. There is a bit of a buildup in the sense that the US bombs the island and some surrounding smaller islands from fall of 1944, and they destroy quite a bit of infrastructure. There's a port in the capital city. There's a whole bunch of airfields that are quite important on the island. And there are some little islands around it that feature into the operations as well. And on some of those tiny islands around Okinawa, there are also air bases. So I think that's also part of setting the stage here for what the plans are. But Matthias, I'll let you take it away with the planning, and then I'll see what I can squeeze in afterwards.
Okay, so maybe we start with the Japanese then. Why not the defender? So looking at the strategic situation, well, it's tough for the Japanese, of course. Late 1944, 1945, you can see the war is not going particularly well. You've talked about the island hopping, and everything is now it's gearing up for what you might call the final battle, which at that stage, everyone probably expects is going to be some sort of invasion of the Japanese mainland. Of course, as we said, Okinawa is part of this particular larger picture here. So how can you actually defend something like this? So the Japanese focus in on Okinawa, you might say from 1943 onwards, because this is when they begin to build these air bases there. You already talked about the Allied bombing that comes in. It's mainly about the air bases, to destroy these air bases. It's about destroying the infrastructure. And by late 1944, for example, Naha, the capital, you mentioned it already, is destroyed to about 90%. So you can see both sides are beginning to understand the strategic and also operational value of this particular place. So the Japanese put an entire army in there. It's the 32nd Army. And this is now beginning to build defensive positions. And this is quite interesting because how do you do this? You need the manpower, so the civilian population comes in. The civilian population is basically press-ganged into supporting the war effort. At the same time, you also have an evacuation phase. Jesse, you mentioned the numbers, so hundreds of thousands of civilians. So there's a bit of a struggle, you might, it's a bit of a tension here. So you want to use the civilians to build defensive works. You're also planning on using some of these civilians probably during the fighting. On the other hand, you want to evacuate as many of these non-combatants as you can. The Japanese do that, but then in August 1944, you have an incident where a Japanese ship is sunk. That's the Tsushima Maru incident. So it's torpedoed by an American submarine. and about 1,700 Japanese civilians drown and die. And of course, that, you might say, shifts the mood a little bit back in Okinawa. Do we really want to be evacuated and then get torpedoed? So you can see all sorts of interesting problems and tensions that you can find here. And when you look at the pure military planning, how do you actually fight a battle against a big, overwhelming American force? So the numbers of Japanese forces is a bit debated, particularly once you start to throw the civilians into the mix, but probably at the beginning of the battle, you're looking at around 100,000, roughly speaking, Japanese soldiers. That's the fully trained ones. So that's the proper army. In addition to that, you've got all these other elements. So the actual numbers fighting is much, much higher, but it makes it a bit difficult to really say how strong the forces are. And you know that you're going to have to face the Americans. You know by now about the firepower, about logistical support, about air, all these things. You know this is going to be a problem. So how do you fight a war against them or a battle? Can you prevent the landing of the Americans? Well, probably not, because they've learned that. So the Supreme Commander, we'll talk about the individuals in a bit more detail later on. He decides that, you know what, we're not going to stop the invasion from happening because the Allied firepower is going to completely destroy everything anyway if we try to fight them on the beaches. So he says, well, let them land, and then we're going to fight them inland. And in order to do this, the Japanese establish a number of defensive lines, two very much in particular. And so the idea is that you've got some fighting in the north and then the main fighting down in the south, where you also have, as you already mentioned, you've got the capital. And so this is where a lot of things are going to happen later on when we drill into and down to the more tactical level. So they're thinking about fighting a prolonged battle. They're thinking about fighting a proper defensive battle, inflicting very heavy casualties on the Americans, also hoping that because you're now fighting in what they would see as mainland Japan, the fighting spirit is even higher on the Japanese side. Yes, you've suffered a number of defeats going all the way back to the mainland, but now you're defending your home territory. That always changes everything. I think we talked about this a number of times when we talked about the European theater of war as well. So that's a bit of a game changer.
Well, as far as the Japanese forces are concerned, it's not uncommon that Axis forces at this stage of the war are a bit of a mixed bag. And you referred to that with some civilians maybe being press ganged into things for labor, but also for other things. This 32nd Army, it has some very good troops, some very good army troops. For example, the 62nd Division has combat experience from previous fighting in China. The 24th Division's also been in China, but it hasn't fought as much. But then you have, last minute sort of naval personnel converted into infantry, which is never what you would want, I guess, as an army general. I'm not sure how you would feel, Matthias, as an officer, if all of a sudden you got a bunch of converted sailors who last week were cavorting around on a German frigate, and now all of a sudden they're supposed to do stuff that you need them to do. Probably not the ideal scenario. Let's put it that way. In any case, he doesn't want to offend any Kriegsmarine, German Navy, current serving sailors who are listening out there.
Keep very stumm here. Keep it very stumm.
Exactly. In any case, the thing for the Japanese is they also have something like 20,000 of these civilian home guard units, let's call them that, who are, okay, they have rifles, but they're not worth particularly much in terms of combat value. And they even go so far as to force teenagers, about 2,000 teenagers, to fight in different capacities as much as they possibly can. Some are as young as 14. So we might be more familiar with this from pictures from the European theater, sort of last-ditch defense of Berlin, for example. There are some teenagers, not as many as old men, but some teenagers who are involved. And that's definitely the case here. So you see another bit of a parallel with attacking the homeland, the lengths that this kind of dictatorship is going to go to in order to try to defend itself. And this teenage unit is supposedly called, and here's another interesting parallel maybe, with the Germans. I'm not sure about the precision of this translation, but generally in English they're referred to as the Blood and Iron Student Corps. So anybody who's into German history knows that blood and iron is also kind of a popular idea there in some cases. I think as well, I just wanted to throw back again as far as this Japanese plan to let the Americans land essentially and then fight them later when they're already kind of bogged down. It comes from experience, as you say. The Japanese, that is, ferociously defended the landing beaches on some earlier parts of this island hopping campaign. Tarawa comes to mind, I think Peleliu as well. And they realized that, yeah, we can inflict some losses, but the naval firepower in particular from all these battleships and other ships sitting off the coast that the US has, that the Japanese can't do that much about, are going to cause us unsustainable losses as well. And the proportion is going to be better for us if we go back into those forests and go back onto those limestone ridges in the south. There's supposed to be a naval component to the Japanese response as well. In theory, the Navy says, or Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo says, right, let the Americans land, let them get bogged down in fighting for position by position, and then we are going to deliver a decisive, crushing blow to the US Navy off the coast. And all those Americans will then have less firepower, won't have the logistics that they normally have, and we can deal with them that way. Now, if you know a little bit about the situation of the Japanese Navy in spring 1945, you will probably be, dear listeners and watchers, a little skeptical about how that plan is going to pan out. And quite a few of the Japanese army officers on Okinawa also were a little bit skeptical. I read one account where from a lower ranking officer where he basically says, I hear what my men say about the Navy and the Imperial Headquarters in Tokyo, who are, in their point of view, completely out of touch as to what we expect to happen here. And he says, well, no one from the Imperial Headquarters is going to come and give themselves trouble and support us here on Okinawa because Naha's red light district has been burnt down already. So this gives you an idea. Of course, we often think about the Japanese morale as, unshakable, and most of them fight to the death and all of this. But they're people too, and they have morale that goes up and down as well. And it's not awesome, let's put it that way, on Okinawa. And I think that's a little, you get a little sense there of the disconnect between the head of the Japanese military, what they're trying to do, what they see as reality and realistic, and what the people much closer to the firing line think is realistic. Now, a gap between those two is quite common in every conflict, I think, but it's a gaping abyss in the Japanese case in 1945. I just wanted to jump in quickly here with another project that we've been working on at Battle Guide, and it has to do with Okinawa as well. We've written a book together, and that means Matthias plus me plus Dan and Spencer from our sister podcast on the First World War, Not So Quiet on the Western Front. The book is called Inferno, and it's about 12 battles that shaped the 20th century from the two world wars. And guess what? Okinawa is one of those battles that we think shaped the 20th century, and I wrote the Okinawa chapter. So if you're interested in a deeper dive into Okinawa and why it was important in the grand scheme of history, then by all means, check out Inferno. You can do that at battleguide.co.uk/inferno.
It very much is. And I think we explored this in quite some depth and detail in previous episodes. We were looking at the Chinese-Japanese conflicts, looking at the Japanese military high command and the constant clashes between the army and the navy. You also, of course, have an air campaign as well. Again, we'll return to that to talk about it in more detail, the kamikazes that come in here. And you talked about the morale and this view of whether you can still win this war or not. And actually, you can also see some of these tensions that you mentioned in the military command at Okinawa itself. So, for example, the general who's commanding the army that is stationed there that is supposed to defend Okinawa is a chap called Oshijima. And he has been called by a number of people who are experts on the Pacific theater of war, the best Japanese general of the war. And he's really interesting when you look at his path, his career, and where he served, because he's a little bit different from some of the other Japanese senior officers, you might say. So his background is very, very traditional. So his father's a samurai, so he's basically then becomes a career officer. So he joins the army as well, goes through it. I think his first deployment is in 1918, when the Japanese sent some forces to, I think, Kamchatka, if I'm not mistaken. It's all part of the Russian Revolution. So that's the first time he goes abroad, really. And then he does the normal kind of military career. He is then involved in this war against the Chinese, where he distinguishes himself. He defeats a number of enemy forces. I don't want to go into too much detail because, again, we'd be here forever. And we talked about the war with the Chinese in different episodes. But actually, he's a rising star, and everyone can see this. And what is really interesting is when the war breaks out against the US in 1941, where he's kind of surprised by this, because at that stage, I think he's divisional commander, if I'm not mistaken. So he's not really informed. And he immediately says, well, this is not a good idea, because he understands the economic and military might of the US. And he's then, I think in 1942, if I'm not mistaken, he is... First of all, he's made the head of the NCO Academy. He's then more or less sacked because people say, well, he's not pro-war, he's not really supporting it, he's too negative. They give him another command first to then give him the next command, which is the Army College, which is quite weird. So they sack him from the one education institution because it's not reliable to put him in the other one. That is a bit odd, but there we are. And there he says, and he writes about and talks about this, and he says that the Army and the officer corps in particular, he says, had become drunk with a sense of victory after the fall, particularly of Singapore. That is the big one, because that's really an important battle. And he constantly warned his students and everyone who wanted to hear it or not, that Japan would have a very, very hard time fighting and winning against the US. So you can always see he's very skeptical. And of course, then you fast forward into 1945. And he's brought in as the senior commander of the Japanese forces here on Okinawa. And the way he's fighting, again, you can see there is very defensive, understanding the firepower of particularly of the Americans. We should say the Allies, really, but it's mainly the Americans. And these things that we already mentioned, you can see he's very, very cautious because he understands these things. He then is more or less kind of, you might say, undermined a little bit by his chief of staff, who is much more gung-ho. And there's another general, he's also on the island, and he's really completely gung-ho. He wants to attack the Americans. He actually launches one attack onto the Americans as they land. It's complete bloody disaster for the Japanese, and then they really begin to withdraw into the inland, as we already discussed. So you can see you've got some tensions there, not only between the Navy and the Army, who never really talk to each other in the first place, but also in this high command on the island itself. So all sorts of interesting facets when you look at that.
Right. Have we exhausted the Japanese prep? There's a little bit of morale prep, well, from the Japanese point of view, that goes on as well with respect to the civilians, because they really invest quite a bit in propaganda targeting Okinawan civilians in the lead up to the amphibious assault of the Americans, basically trying to convince them that the Americans are complete brutal enemies and they're going to kill everyone and they're going to rape everyone. And so they're trying to prepare the population for resistance to the end and not in any way accommodating the Americans, collaborating with the Americans, allowing the Americans to have a peaceful occupation of whatever parts of the island they might take. And we will see later on, maybe in the next episode, maybe later in this one, we'll see how things go, that this then also has an effect on the behavior, the tragic behavior of the civilian population. So there are military preparations, and then there's also kind of a political preparation for the coming battle as well, in particular on the Japanese side, because it's their home population, and they want to convince them to act in a way that the military thinks is the way that it wants the civilians to act. So on the one hand, they're evacuating some ostensibly to save lives. On the other hand, they're propagandizing and sort of psychologically terrorizing, I guess you could say, the remaining population, which is going to cause a lot unnecessary loss of life. Right. How about the Americans? What is their plan to get a hold of this island other than firepower? Because, of course, we know they have firepower, right? This fleet that's going to support the amphibious landings, it's 300 warships and more than 1,000 other ships. Minesweepers, the famous ice cream ships may or may not have been there, all sorts of logistics ships, fueling, all sorts of other stuff, support vessels. So you're talking nearly 1,500 vessels in all are going to support this landing. They've got quite a lot of troops, the Americans do, earmarked for this, something like 100,000 army soldiers and something like 88 or 90,000 Marines. They're not all going to land at once, at the same moment, of course, but they're aware of the scope of the problem, the scope of the challenge, and so they've got quite a lot of troops lined up. As to what their detailed plans are for landing and exploiting the island, I will turn it over to you, Matthias.
Well, we are now, of course, in April 1945. So the whole thing starts on the 1st of April 1945, and the battle actually lasts till the 22nd of June 1945. So there's a lot of experience when it comes to amphibious landings here in the US / the Allied forces. So they know how to do this. We've got, of course, you can go to Europe. You've got Sicily, you've got Normandy. But as we said, we also have the island hopping in the Pacific, which, of course, here is far more important because that gives you the right sort of lesson. So they kind of know what they need to do. The big worry and the big fear that the Allies have, and let's call them the Americans, because it's an American battle, isn't it? There are some other nations in inverted commas thrown in. So you've got the UK, you've got Australia, New Zealand, a few Canadians there as well. But really, the fighting itself is an American battle. And they know, of course, that this, as I said earlier, this is now Japanese mainland. The experience that they've had so far is when you fight against the Japanese, and we all know this, why they don't surrender, they fight to the death, all these things, the number of prisoners taken is always very, very low. So very ferocious fighters. So how do you overcome this? We've now said it a number of times. Of course, the first thing that you do is you use firepower. And that, in this case, mainly means naval firepower, because you can just use it, because as you already explained, the Japanese Navy is let's call it politely struggling at that particular stage. If that's the right word.
You're
very
being
nice.
Very nice.
So you don't
struggling
really have
to continue existing, maybe?
Yeah, exactly. So you don't really have to fear battles like you'd seen before at Midway, all these other ones that you have, where you had these naval engagements. So you can really concentrate on providing fire support for the troops as they land and as they then fight their way through the island as well. Because again, when you think about the terrain, when you think about the shape of the island, the entire island can be covered with naval gunfire. That's possible. It's all within reach, so that makes it possible. The Americans don't really know, obviously, what the Japanese defense plan is. Are they going to fight them on the beach? Are they going to fight and land? Not entirely sure. Well, of course, they can see and spot that there are perhaps not all that many and very developed and distinguished defensive works on the beaches, but they don't really know what's happening. So when you then start the landing, yes, you use a lot of firepower to suppress the enemy forces, and then you just basically land as many people as quickly as possible. You land them basically in two areas. That's the northern part and the southern part of the island. This is also why you then have in these two areas of this. Well, let's not reopen this debate about the shape of the island, but the northern and the southern part, where you also got the beaches. This is where you then land. And that's where you start to fight your way inland and then through these defensive lines. And that, of course, is the problem that the Americans face then once you have landed, because even though you do have naval support, you do have air support as well. The moment you go into this overgrown terrain, into this rainforest, it makes it quite difficult to coordinate, for example, indirect fire, because indirect fire support is not as accurate as you would like it to be. If you're trying to knock out a bunker with gunfire from a cruiser or a battleship, that is going to be quite difficult. So these things are more of area weapons rather than really precision weapons. And of course, that means in the end, you need to send in the military force, the ground forces, to fight their way through. And you've already mentioned the numbers. So you're looking at, roughly speaking, 100,000 army guys. about 80 to 90,000, roughly speaking, Marines. And then you've got about 20,000 naval guys as well. When you look at the structure of this force, obviously, as everything in World War II and everything American, it's very, very heavy on logistical resupply. So compared to other armies, the American army does not really produce a lot of frontline troops for the overall numbers that they use, because the setup is very different. It's all about logistical resupply. The Germans in particular, also Japanese, at the very beginning laugh about this and say, well, how silly is that? They can't even fight. Where are all the fighters? They're all somewhere in the back and in the rear, which to large degree is perhaps quite true when you look at the percentages. However, in the long run, that's a much clever way of fighting. And also, of course, when you look at something like Okinawa, you do need logistical resupply, because you do need, for example, the shells for the ships. You do need all the material that gets landed onto the beach. And that is exactly what they're trying to do. When you look at the army itself that's being used here, that's the 10th Army. That is commanded by a chap called Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. Interesting, great name. Those, of course,
absolutely
know a little bit.
Awesome name.
Know a little bit about Southern American history, of course. Simon Bolivar, he was the great liberator of South America from the Spanish, but maybe not. And when you look at the composition of this force, again, it kind of resembles and shows the way the Americans want to fight. So you have you've got 1, 2, 3. You've got 4 infantry divisions. That's the 7th, the 27th, the 77th, and I think the 96th. And then you've also got the 1st, 2nd, and 6th Marine Division. So there's a very heavy Marine contingent here, which makes sense when you look at and think about the idea and the raison d'etre for the Marines, because, well, they're all there to do, they're basically designed in some ways, you might say, and perfect for this island hopping, find their way through amphibious landings and all these things. Now, of course, you've got the naval contingent, and then you've got the Army and Marine Corps Tactical Air Force as well, which, of course, plays a vital role. So the American expectation, to sum this up, is, or the American approach is, of course, very much based on firepower, but there is the understanding that you will have to fight your way through. Looking at the terrain, taking into consideration the experience with the Japanese up to this point, well, points towards a very heavy fight that the Americans are expecting. And they're prepared for that and preparing as they go into the battle.
Yeah, I think that idea that Okinawa, for both sides, is also a little bit of a test case for how might it go if the Americans and allies in a lesser capacity were to eventually invade the Japanese home islands. So I think it's interesting that both sides are kind of keeping an eye on this as, well, what could we do? What could work? What could we expect if ever it came to an invasion of the home island? As far as the mechanics, I guess you could say, of what the Americans hope to do once they land, they want to land mostly on the western coast of the island, kind of in the middle, but a little bit further to the south, because the south is the more important part. If you think about it, the capital city is there. The larger airfields are there. The naval base, the Japanese naval base is there. The port of the town of Naha, destroyed town of Naha, is there. So essentially, once the Americans land on this 12-ish kilometer wide strip on the west coast, they want to move in, grab a couple of important airfields, Kadena and Yontan. If I'm pronouncing that at least halfway right, airfields are two of the more important ones that are closer to this area where the Americans want to land. And they want to take advantage of the geography. Mostly it works in the Japanese favor. But the Americans, because the island is so narrow, they hope to be able to cut it off, reach the east coast, and then you cut the Japanese into 2 pockets. And in theory, then it's harder for the Japanese to coordinate or share resources or move troops or what have you. And you can reduce them, I was going to say more easily, but let's say with less difficulty, because it's still going to be quite a difficult slog. So that essentially, folks, is the situation on the eve of the start of the invasion of Okinawa by the US on April 1st, 1945. Matthias, I think maybe this is a good point where we could wrap up today's episode. We've set the whole stage for the invasion. We just don't have the boots hitting the sand yet. And we could start our next episode there and follow the campaign through its 82 days of combat until the end. Does that sound like a good idea?
That sounds like a perfect idea.
All right. In that case, folks, thank you today for listening and for watching. If you liked what you heard and saw, and you want to make it possible for us to keep doing this and to do more of this in the Pacific and elsewhere related to World War II, then you can become a supporter of the podcast. Again, that's one of the reasons we chose today's topic, because of the feedback from our supporters. You can do that by going to the website bothsidesofthewire.com and signing up there. You can also get access to exclusive content that is not publicly available in our war room, and you can get a free trial for that by entering the code Deep Dark Woods. So that's it for today, for this episode, and we will see you soon in the next one. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. Something like 750-ish kilometers away from the Chinese coast. Sorry, I had a frog in my throat there. Linus, thank you for editing that.
Frog, froggity frog.
Indeed.
Monty Python, yeah.
Reminds me of the Simpsons episode where all the French generals start laughing at this big meeting and like their throats start coming out bullfrog style, whatever. Love France, live there. It's not about that. However, back to 1945.